There is a certain kind of person who is very strange. They walk into a room and almost instantly feel that something is off. No one is raising their voice. There's no
There's a kind of
drama.
person who walks into a room and already knows something is wrong before a single word is spoken. The laughter sounds slightly forced. Someone's eyes are moving just a little too quickly. A pause lingers a half second longer than it should. Most people around them notice nothing. They notice everything. And the moment they do, their mind locks onto it like a satellite dish rotating toward a signal. Precise, automatic, and completely beyond their control. This is the world of the overly aware person. And from the outside, it can look like a superpower. But from the inside, it often feels like a prison with invisible walls. To truly understand this kind of person, we have to start at the beginning, not just psychologically, but biologically, because this level of awareness does not appear out of nowhere. Psychologists have long recognized that people differ dramatically in how they process sensory and emotional information from the world. Dr. Elaine Aron, a research psychologist who spent decades studying this phenomenon, identified a trait she called sensory processing sensitivity. People who carry this trait, commonly referred to as highly sensitive persons, possess a nervous system that is fundamentally wired to process experience more deeply than average. They are not oversensitive in the dismissive way that word is often used. Their brains literally do more work with the same information. Brain imaging research has shown that highly sensitive individuals show greater activation in areas associated with awareness, empathy, and integration of sensory information, particularly the insula and regions of the prefrontal cortex. But sensitivity is only one origin story. There is another path into hyperawareness, and it is far less gentle. It is built not from biology alone, but from necessity. Neuroscientists and trauma researchers use the term hypervigilance to describe a state in which the nervous system becomes chronically tuned to detecting threat. This condition most commonly develops in childhood environments that were emotionally unpredictable, households where a parent's mood could shift without warning, where tension filled the rooms like smoke, or where the child learned early that reading the adults correctly was a difference between safety and pain. A child growing up in that kind of environment does not get to simply be a child. They become observers, interpreters, tiny scientists of human emotion, running constant experiments just to stay safe. Their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes calibrated to catch the earliest possible signal of danger, a certain tone of voice, footsteps that sound heavier than usual, the way a door closes. These children grow into adults who are remarkably perceptive, but who carry the weight of a nervous system that never learned how to stand down. What begins as survival becomes identity. The most visible and exhausting feature of the overly aware person is their relationship with analysis. For most people, a casual interaction is simply a casual interaction. For someone with deep psychological awareness, every exchange carries layers that demand to be examined. Researchers studying the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for self-referential thought, reflection, and mental simulation, have found that it tends to be more persistently active in people who ruminate or who process experience deeply. In overly aware individuals, this network runs like background software that never quite closes. While they're holding a normal conversation, part of their mind is already replaying the beginning of that conversation, scanning for inconsistencies, testing the emotional temperature of what was said versus what was meant. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition operating without an off switch. The consequence is a particular kind of exhaustion that is difficult to explain to people who do not experience it. They can spend an entire evening sitting quietly with friends and arrive home feeling as though they have run a marathon, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because their brain was working at full capacity the entire time, processing social and emotional information that most people never consciously register. What makes this even more complicated is that the same analytical lens that reads the external world is equally, sometimes more brutally, applied to the self. Psychologists refer to this capacity as metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. It is a genuinely valuable cognitive skill, but in people who are overly aware, it operates without mercy. They do not simply feel an emotion. They interrogate it. Sadness arrives and is immediately followed by a demand for justification. Anxiety appears, and within seconds they are questioning whether the anxiety itself is rational, which creates more anxiety, which then requires more analysis. Even happiness becomes suspect. A moment of genuine joy can be interrupted mid-experience by an internal observer asking whether the joy is authentic, whether it will last, whether something is about to go wrong. Research on self-focused attention and psychological well-being consistently shows that while a degree of self-awareness is associated with emotional intelligence, excessive inward monitoring is strongly linked to increased anxiety, depression, and a reduced sense of flow, that quality of being absorbed and present in experience. The overly aware person often understands themselves with remarkable depth, yet struggles to simply inhabit their own life. In relationships, deep awareness creates a specific and painful paradox. The overly aware person is often extraordinarily attuned to the people they care about. They notice when a friend is struggling before the friend says a word. They pick up on the subtle shift in someone's energy when something is being left unsaid. They are the ones people instinctively turn to during a crisis, because being understood by them feels like being truly seen. But the same capacity that makes them profoundly empathetic also strips away a certain innocence. Because they see so much, they also see what others prefer to leave unexamined. The small manipulations people engage in without quite realizing it, the ways affection is sometimes used as currency, the gap between what someone says and what they actually mean. Psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen's work on theory of mind, the ability to model other people's mental and emotional states, suggests that individuals with highly developed social cognition can sometimes find this ability isolating rather than connecting. When you consistently understand more about a social situation than those around you, the experience can become lonesome. You are sitting in a room full of people, seeing a version of reality that no one else appears to be seeing. And explaining what you see rarely helps, because from the outside, it can look like suspicion or cynicism when it is actually just clarity. One of the less obvious but deeply significant dimensions of this experience is its physical component, interoception. The brain's ability to sense and interpret signals from inside the body is processed largely through the insular cortex. Research published in journals of clinical psychology and neuroscience has shown that individuals with high interoceptive sensitivity are more likely to interpret normal physical sensations as threatening, which creates a condition for anxiety loops that feel impossible to interrupt. The overly aware person does not just think too much. They feel too much in a very literal physiological sense. A slightly elevated heart rate becomes cause for alarm. Muscle tension that another person would barely notice becomes a signal their brain reads as danger. Their body and mind form a feedback loop where awareness amplifies sensation. Sensation triggers threat response, and threat response intensifies awareness. The cycle moves fast, and it moves quietly underneath the surface of ordinary daily life. This is one reason why overly aware people often carry a persistent, low-grade sense of unease. Not because anything is objectively wrong, but because their nervous system has been conditioned to treat the absence of detected threat as merely a pause before the next one. The question that matters most is not how to stop being aware. That is not a real option, and frankly, it would be a loss. The depth of perception that overly aware people carry is also the source of their compassion, their creativity, their ability to understand human complexity in ways that genuinely matter. The goal is not to dull the lens. It is to learn what to do with what it shows you. Therapeutic approaches rooted in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and somatic work all converge on a similar insight. Awareness without acceptance becomes suffering. The skill that overly aware people most need to develop is not sharper perception. They already have that in abundance. What they need is the capacity to observe without absorbing, to notice without adopting, to understand without being responsible for fixing. This means learning to distinguish between what is actually theirs to carry and what belongs to the world. Not every tension in a room requires their intervention. Not every person's pain becomes their pain to resolve. Not every insight demands to be spoken, acted upon, or turned into a plan. When overly aware people begin to make this shift, and it is a shift that happens gradually, imperfectly, and through consistent practice rather than sudden revelation, something quietly transforms in how they experience being alive. The awareness does not disappear. It deepens into something more settled. They still read rooms in people and relationships with extraordinary sensitivity, but they begin to do so from a place of curiosity rather than vigilance. The difference is subtle but enormous. Vigilance is driven by fear, the need to predict danger before it arrives. Curiosity is driven by interest, the desire to understand without needing to control the outcome. They begin to experience their own sensitivity not as a liability to be managed, but as a genuine form of intelligence, one that allows them to move through the world with unusual empathy, unusual depth, and an unusual capacity to be genuinely present with people in their most difficult moments. The burden does not vanish, but it becomes something they carry differently, with open hands instead of clenched grip. And in that opening, life becomes, for the first time in perhaps a very long while, something they are actually living rather than constantly preparing to survive.